In the early years of the 20th century, Villisca, Iowa was the kind of town people trusted. It was small, orderly, and predictable, a place where neighbors recognized one another by sight and routine mattered more than excitement. The town rested quietly among rolling farmland, shaped by agriculture, church gatherings, and the steady rhythm of daily work. Nothing about Villisca suggested danger. In fact, it represented the opposite. It was a place where doors were often left unlocked and children moved freely between homes. Life in Villisca followed familiar patterns. Mornings began early, shaped by chores and responsibilities. Evenings were calm, often spent at home with family or attending church events. Crime was rare, and violent crime was almost unheard of. When people spoke of fear, it was usually in reference to storms, crop failure, or illness, not to other people. This sense of safety was deeply ingrained. It was part of Villisca's identity. In 1912, Villisca was home to roughly 1,200 residents. The town had schools, churches, shops, and a railroad line that connected it to the rest of Iowa. News traveled, but slowly. Outsiders were noticeable, and familiarity bred trust rather than suspicion. People believed that if something was wrong, they would know about it. That belief would soon be shattered. At the center of this story is the Moore family, a well-known and respected household in Villisca. Josiah Moore was a successful businessman who worked for a local agricultural equipment company. He was considered reliable, hard-working, and socially engaged. Josiah was active in his church and often participated in community events. He was not a man surrounded by controversy or conflict. His wife, Sarah Moore, was known as a devoted mother and homemaker. She managed the household and cared for their children with a quiet sense of responsibility. Friends described her as reserved but kind, focused on family and routine. The Moores had 4 children. Herman, the oldest, was 11 years old. Catherine was 10. Boyd was 7. Paul, the youngest, was only 5. Like many children in Villisca, their lives revolved around school, church, and family gatherings. They were known in the neighborhood, and their presence was familiar. The Moore family lived in a modest but comfortable house on East 2nd Street, just a short distance from the town center. The home was typical for the era: 2 stories with multiple bedrooms, narrow hallways, and a layout that reflected function rather than luxury. It was not isolated. Neighbors lived nearby. The house was part of the town's fabric. On the evening of June 9th, 1912, the Moore family attended a church program for children. It was a special event, one that brought families together in celebration. After the program ended, Josiah and Sarah invited 2 young girls, Lena and Ina Stillinger, sisters aged 12 and 8, to spend the night at their home. Sleepovers were common and considered harmless. There was no sense of danger, no hesitation. The group returned to the Moore house later that night. What happened afterward would become one of the most disturbing crimes in American history. But before that night, before the violence, there were signs. Subtle, easily dismissed signs that something was wrong. Like many true crime stories, the Villisca Axe Murders were preceded by moments that only later took on meaning. In the weeks leading up to the murders, reports emerged of strange behavior in Villisca and surrounding towns. Some residents later claimed that an unknown man had been seen lurking near homes late at night. Others reported unlocked doors, missing items, or unexplained disturbances. At the time, these incidents were brushed aside as coincidence or exaggeration. One detail in particular would later trouble investigators deeply. Across the Midwest during this period, a series of axe murders had occurred. Entire families were attacked in their sleep, often with their own farm tools. In many cases, mirrors were covered, doors were locked from the inside, and the killer appeared to remain inside the house for some time after the murders. These crimes were not widely connected at the time, but patterns would later emerge. Villisca, however, did not believe it was part of something larger. On the night of June 9th, the Moore house was filled with the quiet sounds of sleep. The children were settled in their beds. The Stillinger sisters slept in a downstairs guest room. Josiah and Sarah retired to their bedroom upstairs. The house grew silent. There was no forced entry. This fact would become one of the most chilling elements of the case. Sometime after midnight, a figure entered the home or was already inside it. Investigators would later determine that the killer used an axe, likely one belonging to Josiah Moore, taken from the property itself. The weapon was heavy, brutal, and intimate. It required proximity and force. The attacks began upstairs. Josiah Moore was struck first while sleeping. He never had a chance to defend himself. Sarah was attacked next. Both were killed in their bed. The blows were devastating and repeated. The killer then moved from room to room. Each of the Moore children was murdered in their sleep. Afterward, the killer went downstairs and entered the guest room. Lena and Ina Stillinger were killed where they lay. In total, 8 people were murdered inside the house that night. But the violence did not end with death. The killer covered mirrors with cloth. He covered windows. He left the axe behind, cleaned, resting against a wall. He locked the doors. These actions suggested deliberation, not panic. The killer took time. He was not in a hurry. This detail would haunt investigators and the public alike. The next morning, June 10th, concern arose when neighbors noticed that the Moore family had not begun their day as usual. No one answered the door. Eventually, the bodies were discovered, and the town of Villisca was thrown into shock. The crime scene was chaotic almost immediately. Neighbors entered the house. Authorities arrived late. Evidence was disturbed. Potential clues were destroyed. In 1912, forensic science was limited, and crime scene preservation was poorly understood, especially in small towns. From the beginning, the investigation was compromised. The brutality of the murders captured national attention. Newspapers across the country reported on the case. Villisca went from being an unknown farming town to a symbol of terror almost overnight. People struggled to understand how such violence could occur in such a place. The question that dominated every conversation was simple and terrifying. Who could do this? But as the investigation unfolded, another question emerged, one that was even more disturbing. Why was the killer never caught? As suspects were questioned and theories formed, the case grew more complex rather than clearer. Some believed the murders were connected to the earlier axe killings in the Midwest. Others believed the killer was someone local, someone trusted. Still others suggested the crime had no rational explanation at all. What made the Villisca Axe Murders especially horrifying was not just the violence, but the setting. This was not a remote farmhouse. It was a town, a neighborhood, a home where children were welcomed in for the night. The murders shattered the illusion that familiarity equaled safety. As the days passed and fear settled in, Villisca changed. Doors were locked. People watched strangers more closely. Parents kept their children inside after dark. The sense of innocence that once defined the town was gone. And yet, despite the fear, despite the attention, the truth remained elusive. This was only the beginning. In the hours after the murders, the house on East 2nd Street became a place of confusion rather than clarity. When neighbors first entered, they were not prepared for what they would see, and instinct overtook procedure. People moved through rooms, opened doors, lifted bedding, and tried to make sense of the unimaginable. Every step erased potential evidence, though no one understood that at the time. Word spread quickly through Villisca. By mid-morning, the entire town knew something horrific had occurred. Shock turned to disbelief, and disbelief to fear. Parents gathered their children close. Businesses closed early. The sense of safety that had defined the town for decades vanished in a single morning. Local authorities were overwhelmed. Villisca had never faced a crime of this scale or brutality. Officers lacked experience with homicide investigations, let alone a mass murder involving children. They did what they could, but mistakes were inevitable. The house was not secured. The weapon was handled. Potential footprints were trampled. The timeline became blurred almost immediately. As investigators attempted to piece together what had happened, certain details stood out. All of the victims had been struck while asleep. There were no signs of struggle or resistance. This suggested the killer moved silently and deliberately, attacking with precision. The use of an axe, particularly one taken from the property, indicated a killer who was comfortable with extreme violence and close contact. One of the most unsettling details was the covering of mirrors and windows. This act served no practical purpose. It did not help the killer escape. Instead, it suggested ritual, superstition, or a deeply personal compulsion. Investigators could not agree on its meaning, but they agreed it was intentional. Another troubling detail was the position of the axe. It had been wiped clean and placed carefully against a wall. This was not the behavior of someone panicking or fleeing. It suggested the killer felt no urgency, no fear of discovery. The doors were found locked. This fact alone terrified the community. It meant the killer had secured the house from the inside before leaving, or possibly locked it behind them as they exited. Either scenario suggested planning and calm control. Attention soon turned to possible suspects. The first line of inquiry focused on individuals close to the family. Josiah Moore was well liked, but not without disagreements. Business disputes were examined. Personal conflicts were scrutinized. Yet no clear motive emerged. Nothing in his life suggested someone would want to annihilate his entire family. Next, investigators considered the possibility of a transient killer. The Midwest in the early 1900s saw significant movement of laborers, particularly those traveling by rail. Some believed a stranger could have entered town unnoticed, committed the murders, and left just as quietly. This theory gained traction when connections were drawn to other axe murders across the region. In several cases, families had been attacked at night, often with axes, and the killer was never identified. The similarities were disturbing, but evidence linking the crimes was circumstantial. As days passed, fear intensified. Parents no longer allowed children to sleep away from home. Families locked doors that had never been locked before. People listened for sounds at night, imagining footsteps where there were none. Villisca had not only lost 8 lives, it had lost its peace. Newspapers sensationalized the story. Headlines emphasized the brutality, the mystery, and the innocence of the victims. Journalists descended on the town, eager for details. Some reports exaggerated facts, while others speculated wildly. The pressure to find a suspect increased, but the investigation struggled. One suspect drew particular attention. A traveling preacher named George Kelly had been in the area around the time of the murders. Kelly was eccentric, socially awkward, and known to have unusual behavior. He had attended the same church event as the Moore family on the night of the murders. This coincidence made him an immediate person of interest. Kelly was interrogated multiple times. At one point, under intense pressure, he reportedly confessed. However, the confession was inconsistent, filled with contradictions, and later recanted. No physical evidence connected him to the crime. Eventually, he was released. The handling of Kelly would later be criticized as coercive and poorly managed. Other suspects came and went. Some were locals. Others were outsiders. None could be definitively linked to the crime. Each theory raised more questions than answers. Meanwhile, the house itself became a symbol of fear. People avoided walking past it. Some refused to speak its name. Others claimed to feel uneasy near it, as though the violence had left an imprint on the walls. Whether psychological or imagined, the effect was real. The house no longer felt like a home. It felt like a warning. As weeks turned into months, the investigation stalled. Leads dried up. Witness memories faded. Public interest shifted to other stories. But in Villisca, the murders were never forgotten. The town tried to move forward, but something fundamental had changed. Trust had been broken. Familiarity no longer guaranteed safety. The idea that such violence could happen without warning haunted daily life. Yet for all the fear and speculation, the truth remained hidden. The Villisca Axe Murders resisted explanation. Every theory felt incomplete. Every suspect lacked proof. The killer had entered quietly, acted with precision, and disappeared without a trace. And the most troubling realization lingered beneath every conversation. Whoever committed these murders had walked away undetected. They had blended back into the world, and they were never found. As the weeks passed without an arrest, the investigation into the Villisca murders began to lose momentum. What had once been the center of national attention slowly faded from headlines, replaced by newer stories and distant concerns. But in Villisca itself, the fear did not fade. It settled into daily life, reshaping how people thought, how they slept, and how they viewed one another. The Moore house remained standing, silent and empty. Its windows were dark, its doors closed, yet the presence of what had happened inside felt impossible to escape. People crossed the street to avoid walking past it. Some refused to look at it at all. Others found themselves staring at it longer than they intended, drawn by a mix of dread and disbelief. Inside the house, the rooms were unchanged. The layout remained exactly as it had been on the night of the murders. Narrow hallways, small bedrooms, close quarters. It became increasingly clear to investigators how easily a killer could move through the space without waking anyone. The house itself had offered no resistance. As authorities reviewed what little evidence remained, frustration grew. The lack of physical clues made every theory fragile. No fingerprints could be reliably analyzed. Blood evidence provided limited insight. Witness accounts conflicted or proved unreliable. Each path of inquiry led to dead ends. The idea that the killer might have been a stranger remained deeply unsettling. If someone could enter a home, murder 8 people, and vanish without being seen, then no one was truly safe. This fear extended beyond Villisca, spreading to nearby towns and rural communities. Families locked their doors more tightly. Some kept weapons nearby. Nighttime became a period of heightened anxiety. At the same time, suspicion within the community quietly intensified. People began to question one another. Familiar faces were viewed differently. Small behaviors took on new meaning. A person who kept to themselves, someone who traveled often, someone who seemed unaffected by the tragedy. These observations were rarely spoken aloud, but they lingered in thought. The investigation continued sporadically, reopening lines of inquiry whenever a new rumor or tip surfaced. Each time, hope flickered briefly, only to be extinguished by the same reality. There was no clear suspect, no confession, no decisive evidence. Years passed. As time moved on, Villisca changed. New families arrived, children grew up, businesses evolved. Yet the memory of the murders never truly left. It became part of the town's identity, spoken about cautiously, often in hushed tones. Parents warned children about the house, not with details, but with a sense of seriousness that needed no explanation. The Moore family and the Stillinger sisters became symbols rather than individuals. Their names were remembered, but their lives were increasingly overshadowed by the manner of their deaths. This transformation was painful for those who had known them personally, but it was unavoidable. Eventually, the Moore house was sold. Later, it would pass through multiple owners. Some attempted to live there, but few stayed long. Reports of unease, unexplained sounds, and an overwhelming sense of discomfort followed nearly every occupant. Whether psychological or something else, the effect was consistent. The house developed a reputation. It was no longer simply the site of a crime. It became a place people associated with dread. Stories emerged of footsteps, whispers, and strange sensations. While none of these accounts could be verified, they contributed to the growing legend surrounding the property. For some, the idea of the house being haunted felt like a way to explain the unexplainable. If the violence had left an imprint, perhaps it lingered. Perhaps the house itself remembered. For others, the explanation was simpler and more disturbing. The fear came not from ghosts, but from the knowledge that human beings were capable of such acts, that the killer had been real, that they had stood in those rooms, that they had left without consequence. As decades passed, the case was revisited by new generations of investigators. Each brought fresh perspective, but all faced the same limitations. Evidence had degraded. Witnesses had died. Memories had blurred. The truth was buried beneath time and mistake. The Villisca Axe Murders became one of America's most infamous unsolved crimes, not just because of the brutality, but because of the silence that followed. There was no resolution, no justice, no final understanding. This absence of closure left a void. It forced people to confront uncomfortable truths, that some crimes do not end with answers, that some stories do not conclude neatly, that sometimes the person responsible simply disappears into the world. The idea that the killer might have lived among others afterward, unnoticed and unpunished, haunted public imagination. The possibility that they could have been anyone, anywhere, added a layer of unease that never fully dissipated. As the story of Villisca spread beyond Iowa, It became part of American folklore. Books were written. Researchers debated theories. Tourists visited the house. Each retelling added layers of interpretation, but none changed the outcome. 8 lives were lost. A town was changed forever, and the killer was never found. The story of the Villisca Axe Murders does not end with an arrest or a confession. It ends with unanswered questions and a lingering sense of vulnerability. It reminds us that safety can be fragile, that trust can be misplaced, and that violence can emerge where it is least expected. Part 1 of this story is not about solving the crime. It is about understanding the world in which it happened. A world that believed it was safe and was proven wrong. The night of June 9th, 1912, unfolded without resistance, because nothing in Villisca had taught people to expect resistance. The town settled into sleep the way it always had, quietly and without tension. Lamps were extinguished one by one, conversations faded, and the streets emptied. No one was watching for danger. No one was listening for footsteps. The idea that violence could arrive in such a place felt incompatible with daily life. Inside the Moore house, the atmosphere reflected that same sense of calm. The structure was modest, practical, and familiar. Rooms were small, hallways narrow, and doors thin. Sound could travel, but only if it was allowed to. When doors were closed gently and movement was careful, noise softened quickly. The house did not amplify chaos. It absorbed stillness. The Moore family returned from the church program in good spirits. The evening had been ordinary, even pleasant. Children were tired. Adults were ready for rest. There was no argument, no tension, no sense that this night would be remembered for anything other than routine. When the family prepared for bed, they followed patterns repeated hundreds of times before. Josiah and Sarah Moore retired upstairs, and the children settled into their rooms nearby. Downstairs, the Stillinger sisters lay down in the guest room, comfortable and unafraid. The house grew quiet, not all at once, but gradually, as breathing slowed and awareness faded. Sleep arrived naturally. At some point after midnight, the balance of that space changed. The killer's entry remains one of the most important unanswered questions in the case. There were no signs of forced entry. Doors were intact. Windows were unbroken. This fact alone narrows the possibilities, but it does not clarify them. Either the killer entered through an unlocked door, or the killer was already inside before the family returned home. As the years turned into decades, the murders became part of a larger cultural narrative about unsolved crime. They were cited as examples of investigative failure, of the limits of early forensic science, and of the vulnerability of seemingly safe communities. The story endured because it defied explanation. It also endured because it tapped into something deeply human. The fear that violence can emerge without warning, the discomfort of not knowing who to trust, the realization that safety is often assumed rather than guaranteed. Villisca itself continued to exist, changed but functioning. New residents arrived. Children grew up who had not been alive when the murders occurred. For them, the crime was history rather than memory. Yet even they felt its presence. The story was passed down, not as entertainment, but as caution. The Moore house remained a symbol. Its walls held the weight of interpretation. Each person who approached it brought their own understanding of what had happened and what it meant. For some, it was a site of tragedy. For others, a reminder of unresolved danger. For many, it was both. As Part 2 progresses, the focus turns increasingly toward what the case became, rather than what it was. The murders did not end with the deaths of 8 people. They continued in the form of fear, speculation, and unresolved tension. The true impact of the Villisca Axe Murders was not limited to a single night. It extended forward, shaping how people understood safety, community, and the limits of certainty. The crime's refusal to be solved ensured that it would remain present long after those directly affected were gone. And that enduring presence is what makes the case so unsettling. Not because of what is known, but because of what never was. As time moved further away from the night of the murders, the investigation entered a phase that was less about discovery and more about persistence. Law enforcement did not officially close the case, but the absence of progress changed how it was approached. What remained was not an active pursuit, but a lingering obligation. Files were kept, notes were preserved, but momentum was gone. The early urgency had dissipated. Investigators revisited earlier suspects, not because new evidence had emerged, but because there was nowhere else to look. Each return felt less hopeful than the last. Statements were reread, timelines reconstructed again and again. Yet the facts never shifted. They remained static, resistant to interpretation. The traveling preacher was questioned repeatedly over the years. Each interrogation followed the same pattern. Nervous behavior was noted. Inconsistencies were highlighted. His past movements were scrutinized. But no matter how closely his story was examined, it never aligned fully with the crime. His confession, extracted under pressure, continued to unravel under scrutiny. It lacked coherence. It lacked details only the killer would know. He remained a suspect in memory, but not in proof. Other individuals were examined with similar intensity. Some were men with violent tendencies. Others were individuals whose personalities made them stand out. A few had conflicts with members of the Moore family. Each theory seemed plausible at first glance, but none survived sustained examination. The investigation suffered from an imbalance. There were too many possibilities and not enough evidence. Without physical proof to anchor suspicion, every theory existed on equal footing. This created an environment where speculation flourished, but certainty remained unreachable. In small towns at the time, unlocked doors were common. Trust was cultural. Fear was not. An unlocked door would have allowed entry without effort or sound. It would not have required tools, force, or risk. The killer could have stepped inside as easily as stepping into their own home. But the alternative possibility is more unsettling. If the killer was already inside the house, they would have had to wait. Waiting requires patience. It requires silence. It requires control over impulse. A person hiding in the house would have listened to the family return, heard their voices, their movements, their laughter, and their routines. They would have known when lights were extinguished. They would have known when footsteps stopped overhead. Waiting transforms the crime from opportunity to intention. Once the house was quiet, the killer began upstairs. This was not accidental. By attacking the parents first, the killer eliminated the only immediate threat. Josiah Moore was physically capable, and awake adults are unpredictable. Killing him while he slept removed that uncertainty. The first blows were delivered while he was unconscious, heavy, and controlled. The choice of weapon mattered. An axe is brutal, but it is also effective at close range. It requires strength, but it does not require finesse. Investigators later noted that the blunt side of the axe was used in several strikes. This detail is critical. The blunt end reduces sharp cutting sounds. It allows repeated blows without the slicing noise that might carry through a quiet house. It also requires the killer to strike again and again, increasing intimacy and control. Sarah Moore was attacked next. She did not have time to wake fully. The bed absorbed sound. The room contained the violence. The killer did not rush through this space. Evidence suggested movement, repositioning, and deliberate adjustment. These actions take time. They require light. They require calm. From the parents' room, the killer moved through the rest of the house. Each child was attacked in their bed. None showed signs of defensive wounds. None attempted to flee. There were no overturned furniture pieces, no broken objects, no evidence of panic. The children did not wake in time to understand what was happening. They were overwhelmed instantly. Silence was preserved. Downstairs, the Stillinger sisters were sleeping in the guest room. They were not part of the Moore household. They had come to the house because it felt safe. They were children welcomed into a familiar space after a church event. They were not targets because of who they were. They were targets because they were present. They were killed in the same manner. 8 people died inside the house that night, and none of them escaped their beds. This fact alone forced investigators to reconsider everything they thought they understood about violent crime. Most murders involve noise, struggle, unpredictability. This one involved control. The killer managed sound. They managed movement. They managed time. After the murders, the killer did not leave immediately. This is one of the most disturbing aspects of the Villisca case. Evidence suggested that someone remained in the house for a period of time after the killings. Food was eaten. Animals were tended. These actions were not necessary for escape. They did not reduce risk. They did not benefit survival. They served comfort. Remaining in the house was a choice. It suggested confidence. The killer did not fear discovery. They understood how long it would take before anyone noticed something was wrong. They knew the routines of the town. They knew when absence would raise concern and when it would not. This knowledge implies familiarity, either with the Moore family, with Villisca, or with small towns like it. Inside the house, mirrors were covered, windows were obscured. These actions served no practical purpose. They did not hide the bodies. They did not block entry or exit. They did not aid escape. They were deliberate and symbolic. Some investigators believed the coverings reflected superstition. Others believed the killer did not want to see their own reflection. Another interpretation suggested the killer was attempting to control the environment, separating the interior of the house from the outside world. Whatever the reason, it indicated a psychological dimension beyond violence. The axe was cleaned. Blood was wiped from the blade. This required light, water, and time. The killer was not acting in darkness or haste. They were methodical. The weapon was then placed carefully inside the house rather than discarded. This decision suggests the killer was finished, not fleeing. Doors were locked. This detail became one of the most haunting elements of the case. Whether the killer locked the doors before leaving or after returning inside, the result was the same. The house was sealed deliberately. The victims were hidden from view while the town slept on, unaware of what had occurred. The killer then left quietly. No one reported seeing a stranger leaving the area. No unusual sounds were heard during the night. No reliable footprints were preserved. The crime existed in isolation, enclosed within the walls of the house. Morning arrived, as it always did. Neighbors began their routines and noticed something was wrong only when routine failed. No movement, no sounds, no response at the door. Concern grew slowly, then suddenly. When the bodies were discovered, chaos followed. People entered the house without understanding what they were destroying. Bedding was moved, objects were handled, evidence was contaminated. By the time authorities arrived, the scene had already been compromised. Investigators were unprepared. Villisca had never faced a crime of this scale. Forensic science was limited. Procedures were inconsistent. The investigation struggled from its first moments, not because of indifference, but because of inexperience. As word spread, fear took hold. Doors were locked for the first time. Children were kept inside. Trust fractured. The idea that someone could kill an entire household and disappear unsettled the town deeply. Comparisons to other axe murders across the Midwest began almost immediately. In multiple towns, families had been killed at night in similar fashion. Entire households destroyed. No clear motive, no arrests. Railroads connected these places, offering silent passage between communities. Yet not everyone believed the killer was a stranger. Some believed the murderer knew the Moore house intimately, knew where people slept, knew how to move without sound, knew the rhythms of the town. This suggested local knowledge, if not local identity. The investigation stalled between these two possibilities. A stranger who passed through unseen, or someone familiar who blended back into daily life. Both explanations were terrifying. As fear deepened, rumors replaced facts. Suspicion crept into everyday interactions. Familiar faces felt less familiar. The Moore house stood empty, its presence heavy and unavoidable. People avoided it. Some crossed the street rather than walk past it. Others stared at it longer than they intended, drawn by disbelief. The house no longer felt like a home. It felt like a warning. The investigation into the Villisca murders struggled not only because of limited evidence, but because of the kind of crime it was. Investigators were used to disputes that escalated, to visible motives, to crimes that left behind emotional fingerprints. What they encountered in the Moore house was something different. It was a crime that appeared emotionally empty. There was no rage left behind, no message, no explanation, only silence. As authorities moved through the house in the days following the discovery, they began to understand how thoroughly the killer had controlled the environment. Every room told the same story. Beds were the center of the violence. There was no sign of pursuit, no indication that anyone had chased or been chased. Movement had been one-directional, deliberate, and contained. The killer moved from room to room with certainty. This suggested planning, but not necessarily premeditation in the traditional sense. There was no evidence of written plans, no known threats, no history of conflict that pointed clearly toward violence. Instead, the planning appeared practical rather than emotional. The killer understood sequence. They understood priority. Adults first, children next, guests last. The order mattered. It reduced risk. It reduced unpredictability. It ensured that no one was left awake long enough to respond. Investigators also noted the absence of theft. Nothing of value had been taken from the house. Money remained, Personal items were untouched. This ruled out robbery as a motive and further complicated attempts to understand why the murders had occurred at all. Without a clear motive, speculation filled the gap. Some believed the murders were part of a broader pattern, a series of axe killings that had taken place across the Midwest in the years leading up to 1912. In several of those cases, entire families had been attacked in their sleep, often with household tools. The similarities were difficult to ignore, even if definitive proof was lacking. Railroad access became a point of focus. Villisca was connected by rail to other towns, allowing movement without long-term presence. A person could arrive quietly, stay briefly, and leave before suspicion formed. In an era without centralized records or reliable identification, such movement was almost impossible to track. This theory suggested a killer who drifted between towns, selecting targets based on opportunity rather than personal grievance. But another theory persisted, one that unsettled Villisca far more deeply. What if the killer was local? This idea gained traction as investigators considered how comfortably the killer had moved through the house. Familiarity with the layout would have reduced hesitation. Knowing which doors creaked, which floors carried sound, and where people slept would have made silence easier to maintain. Local knowledge also explained confidence. A local person would understand routines, habits, and timing. They would know how long it took for concern to arise. They would know when neighbors were awake and when they were not. If this theory was true, the killer had not fled Villisca. They had remained. This possibility altered the way people saw one another. Innocuous behaviors were reinterpreted. Someone who avoided discussion, someone who appeared calm, someone who did not attend funerals. Small details became magnified in the absence of answers. Suspicion spread quietly, rarely spoken aloud, but always present. The handling of the crime scene further complicated matters. In 1912, crime scene preservation was not a standard practice, especially in small towns. Neighbors entered the house before authorities arrived. They touched objects. They moved bedding. Some even attempted to clean out of shock or misplaced compassion. These actions destroyed evidence that might have answered crucial questions. Footprints were lost. Fingerprints were unreliable. Blood patterns were altered. What remained was interpretation rather than proof. As weeks passed, official investigations slowed. Leads dried up. Tips became repetitive or implausible. Newspapers moved on. Villisca, however, did not. The town carried the weight of the crime long after national attention faded. Parents slept lightly. Children were watched more closely. Doors that had once been left unlocked were now secured each night. The murders had introduced a new awareness, one rooted in vulnerability. The Moore house itself became an object of dread. Its physical presence remained unchanged, but its meaning transformed completely. What had once been an ordinary home now represented the worst thing that had ever happened in the town. People avoided walking past it. Some refused to let their children go near it. Others felt compelled to look, drawn by disbelief rather than curiosity. The house became a reminder that violence did not always announce itself. Years passed without resolution. Suspects came and went, each one failing to withstand scrutiny. Confessions were obtained under pressure and later recanted. Evidence failed to support accusations. No arrest led to conviction. Each failure deepened the sense that the truth was slipping further away. As time moved on, the case shifted from investigation to legend. Stories began to circulate. Some were rooted in fact, others were shaped by fear and imagination. The line between history and folklore blurred. The house gained a reputation beyond the crime itself. Reports of unease, unexplained sounds, and sensations of being watched emerged from those who entered it. Whether these experiences were psychological or something else, they reflected the lasting impact of the murders. The lack of resolution created space for fear to linger. Without a known killer, there was no closure. Without closure, there was no clear ending. The story remained open, unfinished, and unresolved. This uncertainty was perhaps the most damaging aspect of all. The Villisca Axe Murders forced people to confront an uncomfortable truth. Some crimes do not end with answers. Some violence does not come with explanation. And sometimes those responsible are never held accountable. The idea that the killer might have lived a normal life afterward haunted public imagination. The possibility that they blended into society, unnoticed and unpunished, added a layer of unease that never fully disappeared. As the years turned into decades, the murders became part of American true crime history. Books were written. Researchers revisited old files. New theories emerged. None could definitively explain what had happened inside the Moore house on that quiet summer night. The crime resisted closure. It existed as a question rather than an answer. And as long as that question remained unanswered, Villisca remained a place defined not only by what happened, but by what never came afterward: justice. In the months following the murders, the investigation into the crime did not advance so much as it expanded outward, becoming less focused with every step. What began as a search for a killer gradually transformed into a struggle to understand how nothing had been found at all. Each unanswered question created space for another, and soon the case was defined not by evidence, but by absence. Investigators revisited the Moore house repeatedly, hoping that something had been overlooked. But every return brought the same realization. Whatever clues once existed had either been destroyed or were never collected properly. The house had been entered by too many people too early. Objects had been moved, surfaces touched, patterns altered. The scene no longer represented the night of the murders. It represented confusion layered on top of shock. This lack of clarity forced investigators to rely more heavily on people rather than proof. Attention turned to those who had been in Villisca around the time of the murders. Anyone who stood out in behavior, appearance, or movement became a point of interest. In a town that valued sameness and routine, deviation attracted notice. Strangers were remembered more clearly than locals. Locals were scrutinized more closely than strangers. One of the earliest figures to draw attention was a traveling preacher who had been in the area during the time of the murders. He was quiet, socially awkward, and known to behave in ways that others found unsettling. He had attended the same church event as the Moore family on the night of the murders. This coincidence was enough to elevate suspicion. Under questioning, the preacher appeared nervous and inconsistent. Investigators interpreted this as guilt rather than fear. After prolonged interrogation, he reportedly confessed to the murders, but the confession was fragmented, contradictory, and lacked details only the killer would know. Soon after, he recanted. No physical evidence connected him to the crime. Despite this, suspicion lingered. In an investigation starved of certainty, Even weak connections felt significant. But over time, it became clear that the confession could not be trusted. The preacher was released, and the case moved on, leaving behind yet another unresolved thread. Other suspects followed. Some were men with criminal histories, others were individuals with personal grievances. Each theory was examined, debated, and eventually abandoned. None could withstand scrutiny. The lack of evidence meant that suspicion alone was never enough to proceed. As investigators grew more frustrated, public confidence in the investigation declined. Villisca residents began to believe that the truth might never be uncovered. This belief altered how people spoke about the case. Conversations became cautious. Speculation replaced hope. The murders were no longer something that would be solved, but something that had to be lived with. The idea of a traveling killer remained prominent. Reports of similar axe murders across the Midwest continued to surface. In many cases, entire families had been killed in their sleep, often with household tools. In some, mirrors were covered. In others, the killer appeared to linger at the scene. The similarities were unsettling, but connections were circumstantial. Without centralized law enforcement or shared investigative resources, these cases existed largely in isolation. Patterns were recognized only after the fact, and even then, proof remained elusive. Railroads became a symbol of fear. They connected towns quietly, efficiently, and anonymously. A person could arrive at night, leave by morning, and never be remembered. This mobility made the idea of a serial killer plausible, even if it could not be confirmed. It also made the idea deeply frightening. But the theory of a local killer never fully disappeared. Many residents believed the murders could not have been committed by someone unfamiliar with the house. The killer had moved with confidence. They had known where people slept. They had known how to move without sound. They had known how long they had before discovery. These details suggested familiarity. If the killer was local, then the danger had never left. It had simply gone unnoticed. This possibility changed the social fabric of Villisca. Trust eroded quietly. People observed one another more closely. Interactions felt less innocent. No accusation needed to be spoken aloud for suspicion to exist. It lived in glances, in silence, in the way conversations ended abruptly. The Moore house remained empty, its presence heavy. It was not demolished. It was not forgotten. It stood as a physical reminder of what had happened and what had not been resolved. Each day, it remained unchanged, reinforced the sense that the case itself was frozen. As years passed, the investigation lost momentum. New leads were rare. Old leads went nowhere. Official interest waned. Yet the story refused to disappear. It lingered in memory, resurfacing whenever something went wrong, whenever fear needed a reference point. The murders became a kind of boundary in time. People spoke of life before Villisca and life after. The crime marked the end of an era of unquestioned safety. It introduced the idea that violence could exist without reason, without warning, and without consequence. For those who had known the victims, this realization was particularly painful. The Moore family had been real people, not symbols. They had lives, routines, and futures that were erased in a single night. Over time, those details faded, replaced by the image of the crime itself. The Stillinger sisters, too, became part of the tragedy rather than individuals remembered for who they were. Their presence in the house had been incidental, yet their deaths were just as final. The investigation's failure to deliver justice compounded the loss. Without accountability, grief remained unresolved. Anger had nowhere to go. Fear had no outlet. The crime existed as a wound that never closed. As decades passed, the case entered a new phase. Researchers, writers, and amateur investigators began to revisit the murders, poring over old records and newspaper accounts. Each brought a new theory, a new interpretation. Some believed the truth was hidden in overlooked details. Others believed it had been lost forever. Despite renewed interest, the outcome remained the same. No arrest, no conviction, no certainty. The Villisca Axe Murders became defined by what they lacked rather than what they revealed. They stood as a reminder that not all questions are answered, and not all stories conclude with resolution. The crime did not fade because it was solved. It endured because it was not. And as Part 2 continues, the focus shifts deeper into the failures, the theories, and the lasting consequences of a night that resisted explanation from the very beginning. As official investigations slowed, something else began to accelerate in Villisca. In the absence of answers, interpretation took over. Where evidence failed, imagination stepped in. People began to reconstruct the crime in their own minds, filling gaps not with facts, but with fear. Each retelling subtly reshaped the story, emphasizing different details, amplifying uncertainty, and deepening unease. Rumors became a parallel investigation. Some claimed to have seen unfamiliar figures near the Moore house days before the murders. Others recalled strange noises in the night that, at the time, had seemed unimportant. A few insisted they had felt watched, even before the crime occurred. None of these accounts could be verified, but once spoken aloud, they became difficult to dismiss. Memory itself became unreliable. Psychologists would later explain how trauma reshapes recollection. After a shocking event, people often reinterpret past experiences through the lens of what they now know. Ordinary moments are recast as warnings. Neutral encounters become suspicious. This phenomenon played out across Villisca, turning hindsight into a breeding ground for doubt. As the investigation dragged on, frustration grew among residents. Some believed authorities had mishandled the case from the beginning. Others felt investigators had focused too narrowly on certain suspects while ignoring others. Accusations of incompetence and bias surfaced quietly, rarely voiced directly but widely felt. The lack of progress created emotional distance. People stopped expecting resolution. The murders became something that happened rather than something that would be solved. This shift marked a turning point. When hope for justice fades, a crime transforms from an active wound into a permanent scar. Yet even as expectations lowered, fear remained. Parents continued to monitor their children closely. Nighttime routines changed permanently. Doors were checked repeatedly. Sounds that once blended into the background now demanded attention. The quiet of Villisca, once comforting, had become oppressive. The Moore house stood at the center of this psychological shift. Its continued existence, unchanged and unresolved, reinforced the sense that the past had not been dealt with. Each day it remained. Standing felt like an unanswered question looming over the town. For some, the house represented tragedy. For others, it represented danger. For many, it represented both. Over time, the house began to acquire stories that extended beyond the crime itself. People who entered it reported feelings of unease. Some described a heaviness in the air, a sense of being watched, or an inability to stay inside for long. These accounts varied in detail but shared a common theme. The house did not feel neutral, it felt marked. Skeptics dismissed these experiences as psychological responses to known trauma. Believers argued that violence of that magnitude left something behind. Whether one explanation or the other, the effect was real. The house became a place people avoided. As years passed, the murders entered a different kind of investigation, one driven not by law enforcement, but by curiosity. Writers, historians, and amateur researchers revisited the case, often with more enthusiasm than restraint. Old newspaper articles were reread. Witness statements were re-examined. Small details were elevated to significance. Some theories focused on overlooked suspects. Others proposed entirely new narratives. Each theory offered the promise of clarity, but none delivered certainty. The lack of definitive answers allowed every possibility to coexist. This openness was both compelling and dangerous. It kept the story alive, but it also blurred the line between evidence and speculation. Over time, the crime became layered with interpretations, each one slightly reshaping how it was understood. Despite renewed interest, official records remained unchanged. No new evidence emerged, no confession held up, no arrest led to conviction. The case remained open in theory and closed in practice. It existed in a kind of limbo, acknowledged but unresolved. This state of suspension affected how the murders were remembered. Without resolution, the story lacked an ending. It resisted conclusion. Each retelling felt unfinished, trailing off into uncertainty. This lack of closure became one of the defining characteristics of the Villisca Axe Murders. For the families connected to the victims, this was particularly painful. Grief without resolution lingers differently. It does not settle. It remains active, resurfacing unexpectedly. The absence of justice prevented healing from fully taking place. The loss was compounded by unanswered questions. As the years passed, the case transitioned from law enforcement custody into public imagination. The murders were no longer only a legal matter. They became a narrative, shaped and reshaped by those who encountered it. Writers, historians, and amateur investigators entered the conversation, each bringing a new lens. Some believed the truth was hidden in overlooked details. Others believed it had been lost forever. This shift changed the tone of discussion. The murders were no longer framed solely as a crime to be solved, but as a mystery to be interpreted. The language surrounding the case reflected this change. Words like theory, possibility, and speculation replaced evidence and fact. Certainty eroded. This erosion was not limited to investigators. It affected the broader public as well. As explanations multiplied, confidence diminished. The more people talked about the case, the less they seemed to know. The lack of resolution created a vacuum. Into that vacuum entered increasingly abstract explanations. Some focused on psychology, others on coincidence. A few turned toward superstition. The absence of answers allowed every interpretation to coexist without being disproven. For Villisca, this ambiguity had lasting consequences. The town carried the identity of the crime long after those directly involved were gone. New residents learned the story early. Children grew up hearing about the murders not as distant history, but as part of the town's character. The Moore House was not simply an old building. It was a symbol. This symbolism influenced behavior. People avoided the house even when no logical reason remained. Its presence was enough. It represented a break in normalcy, a reminder that violence had once entered the town without warning. That memory lingered, shaping how people understood safety. The longer the case remained unsolved, the more the murders became untethered from their original context. Details blurred, timelines softened. The distinction between what was known and what was assumed became increasingly difficult to maintain. This created a paradox. The story of the Villisca Axe Murders became widely known, yet deeply misunderstood. Everyone knew the outline. Few knew the details, and even fewer knew which details mattered. As decades passed, the crime was revisited through different cultural lenses. Early interpretations focused on criminal behavior and investigation. Later ones emphasized psychology and social breakdown. More recent retellings often leaned into atmosphere, fear, and the enduring mystery. Each generation reshaped the story. Yet beneath these layers, the core facts remained unchanged. 8 people were killed. No one was held accountable. The case resisted closure. This resistance altered how the crime was remembered. Rather than fading into the past, it remained present, resurfacing whenever discussions turned toward unsolved violence or the limits of justice. The murders became a reference point, a reminder that not all stories end with answers. For those who sought resolution, this was deeply frustrating. Human beings are conditioned to seek patterns, conclusions, and meaning. The Villisca case denied all three. It offered only fragments, each pointing in different directions. This denial created discomfort. Without a clear ending, the story lingered in the mind. It invited continued engagement, not because it was entertaining, but because it was incomplete. The lack of resolution became the defining feature. Investigators who revisited the case later in life often spoke of it with resignation rather than optimism. They described a sense of having exhausted every avenue, only to return to the same uncertainties. The passage of time had not clarified the crime, it had obscured it further. Witnesses aged, memories faded, physical evidence degraded. Each year reduced the possibility of discovery. Yet the case never fully disappeared. It remained open in spirit, if not in practice. It occupied a space between history and present, never settling into either. This unsettled state mirrored the emotional impact of the murders themselves. They existed as a rupture rather than a narrative, a break in continuity, a moment that resisted integration into the normal flow of events. The Moore family and the Stillinger sisters were remembered not only for their deaths, but for what their deaths represented: the fragility of safety, the limits of investigation, the permanence of unanswered questions. As Part 2 continues, the focus moves deeper into the consequences of this unresolved state. The murders did not conclude with the passing of time. They evolved, influencing how people understood crime, fear, and the possibility that some truths remain permanently out of reach. This evolution is as much a part of the story as the night itself, because the Villisca Axe Murders did not end. They simply continued, unresolved, into the future. As the Villisca Axe Murders receded further into the past, the absence of answers began to shape how the crime was understood more than any fact ever could. What had once been a specific event tied to a night, a house, and a group of people slowly transformed into something more abstract. It became a symbol of uncertainty, a reminder that not all violence yields explanation. The longer the case remained unsolved, the more its details became fixed in place. Early newspaper accounts hardened into reference points. Witness statements were quoted repeatedly, even as their reliability diminished. Speculation layered itself on top of memory until the original boundaries of the investigation were difficult to see. This process altered perception. People no longer asked who committed the murders with the expectation of finding an answer. Instead, they asked it as a philosophical question, one that reflected deeper fears about safety and trust. The lack of resolution invited reflection rather than closure. For law enforcement, this shift was uncomfortable. Cases are meant to progress toward resolution. When they do not, they occupy a space that resists categorization. The Villisca murders were neither active nor closed. They existed in a state of suspension, acknowledged but unresolved. This status made it difficult to move forward and impossible to conclude. Investigators who revisited the case in later years often described a sense of futility. They could trace the early missteps, identify moments where evidence might have been preserved, and recognize opportunities that had been lost. But awareness came too late. Time had erased what procedure had not protected. This recognition did not bring peace. Instead, it reinforced the understanding that the truth might never be known. Each review ended where it began, with the same unanswered questions. The repetition itself became exhausting, both intellectually and emotionally. Outside of official channels, the story continued to evolve. True crime writers and researchers approached the case with fresh curiosity, often motivated by the belief that earlier investigators had overlooked something crucial. They scrutinized timelines, re-examined suspects, and proposed new interpretations. Some focused on behavioral patterns, others emphasized geographic connections. A few suggested that the murders were part of a broader phenomenon that could only be understood collectively. Each new interpretation brought temporary clarity, but clarity was always followed by contradiction. For every theory that seemed plausible, another emerged to challenge it. The absence of definitive evidence meant that no idea could be conclusively proven or disproven. This equilibrium of uncertainty allowed the case to persist indefinitely. The Moore house remained central to this persistence. Its physical presence anchored the story in reality. As long as the house stood, the murders felt tangible rather than abstract. Visitors described conflicting emotions when approaching it. Some felt nothing. Others felt unease. A few reported sensations they struggled to explain. Regardless of interpretation, the house provoked reaction. This reaction was part of the legacy. The house had become a vessel for unresolved emotion. Fear, curiosity, grief, and speculation all converged within its walls. It was no longer simply a structure. It was a reminder that something violent had occurred and had never been reconciled. As the years passed, generational distance changed how the murders were discussed. Those who had lived through the event spoke of it with restraint. Their memories were shaped by shock and loss. Younger generations, removed from the immediate impact, encountered the story through retellings. For them, the murders were history, filtered through interpretation and narrative. This distance did not diminish interest. If anything, it increased it. The lack of resolution made the story adaptable. It could be framed as a cautionary tale, a psychological study, or a mystery. Each framing emphasized different aspects, ensuring that the murders remained relevant across time. Yet, no matter how the story was told, its core remained unchanged. 8 people were killed. No one was held accountable. The truth remained elusive. This simplicity made the case enduring. There was nothing to resolve, nothing to conclude. The story ended where it began, in uncertainty. This unresolved state invited continued engagement, not because answers were forthcoming, but because their absence demanded attention. For Villisca, this meant living with a permanent question. The town adapted, as towns do. Life continued, new routines formed, but beneath daily activity, the awareness remained. The murders had altered the town's identity in ways that could not be undone. Safety was no longer assumed. Trust required reinforcement. The case also influenced how people understood crime more broadly. It challenged the belief that every crime has a motive that can be uncovered, that every killer leaves behind evidence, and that time inevitably brings clarity. The Villisca murders demonstrated the opposite. Some crimes remain opaque, resistant to explanation even under scrutiny. This realization carried weight beyond the town itself. The murders entered the broader cultural conversation as an example of the limits of justice. They were cited in discussions about investigative failure, forensic development, and the psychology of violence. The case became a reference point for what happens when certainty is unavailable. As Part 2 approaches its conclusion, the story stands at a threshold. The focus shifts from investigation to consequence, from action to aftermath. What remains is not the search for a killer, but the enduring impact of not finding one. The unanswered questions have shaped every aspect of how the crime is remembered. The Villisca Axe Murders persist not because they are unresolved, but because they resist resolution. They occupy a space that defies narrative closure, and it is within that space that fear continues to exist, long after the night itself has passed. As the investigation into the Villisca Axe Murders continued to yield nothing conclusive, the case entered its final phase, not through resolution, but through exhaustion. Law enforcement agencies did not formally abandon the search, but the energy that once fueled it had dissipated. What remained was maintenance rather than pursuit. Files were preserved, records were stored. The crime was acknowledged, but no longer actively chased. This shift did not bring relief. For many, it brought a deeper unease. The idea that a crime of such scale could simply fade into the background without explanation challenged fundamental assumptions about justice. The murders had not been solved, but they had also not been forgotten. They existed in a space between action and acceptance. Over time, the absence of answers began to shape how people spoke about the case. Instead of asking who committed the murders, people asked how something like this could happen at all. The focus moved away from identity and toward vulnerability. The Moore family had not been targeted because they were extraordinary. They had been targeted because they were ordinary. Their routines, their trust, and their environment had made them accessible. This realization was unsettling. It suggested that safety was not guaranteed by familiarity or routine. It suggested that violence could emerge without warning, without motive that made sense, and without consequence that felt just. The Villisca case embodied this discomfort. As years passed, the murders became part of a broader pattern in American consciousness. They were cited alongside other unsolved crimes as examples of how easily certainty could collapse. The case became less about the specific details of one night and more about what that night represented. The inability to resolve the crime transformed it into a mirror. People projected their fears, beliefs, and interpretations onto the case. Some saw it as evidence of investigative failure. Others saw it as proof that evil could exist without reason. Still others interpreted it as a cautionary tale about complacency. Each interpretation revealed something about the person holding it. The Moore house continued to anchor these reflections. Its physical presence prevented the murders from becoming purely abstract. As long as the house stood, the crime felt tangible. Visitors described standing outside and imagining the events of that night, trying to reconcile the quiet appearance of the building with the violence it contained. For many, this contrast was the most disturbing aspect. The house looked ordinary. It did not announce its history. It blended into its surroundings, much like the crime itself had blended into the rhythms of the town before being discovered. This ordinariness reinforced the unsettling idea that horror does not always announce itself. As the decades progressed, the murders were re-examined through evolving cultural frameworks. Early discussions focused on morality and punishment. Later interpretations emphasized psychology and social context. More recent approaches often frame the case as a study in uncertainty, exploring how people respond when answers are unavailable. Each framework offered insight, but none delivered closure. The persistence of the case highlighted a limitation in how stories are traditionally told. Narratives often rely on resolution to create meaning. The Villisca Axe Murders defied this structure. They offered no conclusion, no lesson neatly tied to outcome. Instead, they left behind an enduring question. What happens when a crime cannot be explained? For Villisca, the answer was adaptation. The town continued to exist, but with altered awareness. Generations grew up knowing the story. Children learned about the murders not as distant history, but as something that had happened where they lived. This knowledge shaped how they understood their environment. The murders became part of local identity, not as a defining feature, but as an undercurrent, a reminder that something irreversible had occurred. This undercurrent influenced how people talked about safety, trust, and vulnerability. Even those who had not experienced the crime directly felt its impact through inherited memory. The absence of justice also influenced how grief was carried. Without resolution, grief did not have an endpoint. It remained open, resurfacing whenever the case was discussed or revisited. The families connected to the victims lived with this ambiguity, knowing that the truth might never be known. This unresolved grief extended beyond individual families. It became collective. The town shared in the loss, not only of lives, but of certainty. The belief that wrongs would eventually be righted had been shaken. In its place was an understanding that some questions remain unanswered indefinitely. This understanding altered expectations. People no longer assumed that time would bring clarity. Instead, they learned that time could obscure as much as it revealed. Memories faded, evidence degraded, opportunities passed. The passage of years did not guarantee progress. The Villisca case illustrated this reality with stark clarity. As interest in the murders persisted, the story continued to be retold, each time shaped by contemporary concerns. During periods of social anxiety, the case was framed as a warning. During periods of introspection, it was examined as a psychological study. During moments of fascination with the unexplained, It was presented as a mystery bordering on the uncanny. Despite these shifts, the core facts remained unchanged. 8 people were killed in their sleep. No one was held accountable. The truth remained out of reach. This consistency gave the case its enduring power. It did not rely on new developments or revelations. Its impact came from what it lacked. The absence of answers forced engagement. It invited reflection rather than consumption. As Part 2 moves toward its conclusion, the story reaches a point where investigation gives way entirely to consequence. What remains is not the search for a killer, but the long shadow cast by their absence. The Villisca Axe Murders did not end with arrests or trials. They ended with silence. And that silence has continued to speak. As the Villisca Axe Murders settled permanently into the category of unsolved crime, the final consequence of the investigation's failure became clear. What was left behind was not simply a mystery, but a permanent psychological presence. The murders no longer belonged only to the night they occurred. They had become something ongoing, something that continued to influence how people thought about safety, trust, and certainty. The absence of an identified killer meant there was no final narrative. There was no courtroom, no verdict, no explanation delivered with authority. Instead, the story ended in fragments. Each fragment pointed in a different direction, and none connected cleanly enough to close the case. This fragmentation altered the way the crime was remembered. Rather than being recalled as a sequence of events with a beginning, middle, and end, the murders were remembered as a rupture, a break in continuity, a moment where normal life failed to resume as expected. This made the crime difficult to place within history. It resisted categorization. For many, this resistance was deeply unsettling. Human understanding depends on structure. We rely on cause and effect, motive and consequence. The Villisca Murders denied all of these. 8 people were killed, and the world moved forward without accountability. This contradicted deeply held beliefs about order and justice. The longer this contradiction persisted, the more it influenced collective thinking. The crime became a reference point in discussions about uncertainty. It was cited when people spoke about the limits of investigation, the fallibility of memory, and the danger of assuming that truth always emerges. Villisca represented the uncomfortable reality that some crimes remain permanently opaque. This realization reshaped expectations. People stopped believing that time alone would resolve unanswered questions. They learned that time could harden uncertainty rather than dissolve it. The Villisca case demonstrated that without decisive evidence, even the most horrific crimes could fade into unresolved history. The Moore House continued to embody this lesson. Its continued existence reinforced the idea that the past was not settled. Each person who encountered the house brought their own understanding of what had happened and what it meant. Some felt sadness. Others felt fear. A few felt nothing at all. But no one encountered it neutrally. The house demanded interpretation. Over the years, the property changed hands, and each new owner confronted the same reality. Living in the space was difficult. Even those who approached the house with skepticism reported discomfort. Whether this was psychological or something else was debated endlessly, but the experience itself was consistent. The house did not feel ordinary. This perception fed into the evolving legacy of the crime. The murders were no longer confined to historical records. They had entered cultural memory. Stories circulated. Experiences were shared. The case accumulated meaning beyond its original facts. At the same time, the lack of resolution protected the crime from being fully consumed. Solved crimes often settle into explanation. Unsolved crimes remain active in the imagination. They provoke ongoing engagement because they resist finality. Villisca remained relevant precisely because it never concluded. This relevance extended beyond the town itself. Across the country, the murders were referenced in discussions about early forensic limitations and investigative error. They were used as examples of how easily evidence could be lost and how difficult recovery could be once initial mistakes were made. The case became instructional as much as it was disturbing. Yet instruction did not bring comfort. Knowing why the case failed did not reveal who committed the murders. Understanding the limitations of the investigation did not undo the outcome. The knowledge that mistakes were made only deepened frustration. This frustration became part of the story. It underscored the idea that justice is not guaranteed by effort alone. It depends on timing, procedure, and chance. In Villisca, chance had favored the killer. The absence of justice also shaped how grief persisted. Without an identified perpetrator, mourning remained incomplete. There was no focal point for anger, no resolution to accept. The loss remained open-ended. Families carried this ambiguity quietly, knowing that answers might never arrive. This ambiguity extended outward, influencing how the broader community processed the crime. The murders became something people learned to live alongside rather than resolve. They were acknowledged, remembered, and referenced, but not concluded. This ongoing presence shaped local identity in subtle ways. Villisca adapted, but it did not forget. As years turned into generations, the murders were absorbed into the town's narrative. New residents learned about them early. Children grew up hearing the story, not as sensational history, but as inherited memory. The crime became part of the town's background, always present but rarely confronted directly. This quiet integration was perhaps the most enduring consequence of all. The Villisca Axe Murders did not dominate daily life, but they influenced it. They altered assumptions about safety. They complicated trust. They reminded people that violence could exist without explanation or consequence. As Part 2 reaches its end, the focus rests not on the night itself, but on what followed. The true weight of the murders was not carried in the moment of violence alone. It was carried forward through decades of uncertainty. It shaped how people understood crime, justice, and the limits of certainty. The killer was never found. The truth was never confirmed. And the story never fully ended. This unresolved state is not a failure of storytelling. It is the reality the Villisca case demands. The absence of resolution is the conclusion, because some crimes do not close. They linger, they endure, and they remain permanently unanswered. In the years following the murders, something subtle but profound began to happen. The focus of the Villisca Axe Murders shifted away from the killer and toward the place where the violence occurred. As time passed without resolution, attention gravitated naturally toward the one element that remained unchanged: the house. The Moore house did not move. It did not age in the way people did. It remained where it had always been, occupying the same plot of land, surrounded by the same streets, watching generations pass by. While suspects faded, Theories collapsed and memories blurred. The house endured. At first, it was simply avoided. People crossed the street rather than walk past it. Children were told not to linger near it. Visitors to Villisca were quietly warned about it, not with drama, but with hesitation. The house was not spoken about loudly. It did not need to be. Its presence alone was enough. Over time, avoidance turned into something more complex. People began to notice how the house felt. This was difficult to articulate. There were no obvious signs of danger. The structure looked ordinary. The exterior did not announce its history. It resembled countless other farmhouses built during the same period. Yet those who approached it often described a subtle discomfort, an unease that did not resolve even after standing there for several minutes. Some described the sensation as heaviness. Others said the air felt different, as though sound did not behave normally near the house. A few mentioned an inexplicable reluctance to step closer, even when curiosity pushed them forward. These descriptions varied, but they shared a common thread. People felt something they could not easily explain. Skeptics dismissed these reactions as psychological. They argued that knowledge of the murders shaped perception. Anyone aware of the house's history would naturally feel discomfort. The mind, primed by expectation, would generate sensation where none existed. This explanation made sense, and for many, it was enough. But the reactions continued. Visitors who claimed not to know the full details still reported unease. Some entered the house briefly and left without being able to articulate why. Others found themselves distracted, restless, or unusually anxious inside. These reactions were not dramatic. They were quiet and personal. The house did not terrify. It unsettled. This distinction mattered. Fear is sharp and immediate. Unsettling feelings linger. They follow you after you leave. They resist dismissal. The Moore house produced this quieter form of discomfort, the kind that stays with a person longer than expected. As the house remained standing, it accumulated meaning. It became more than a crime scene. It became a symbol of interruption. Something terrible had happened there, and nothing had fully corrected it. The murders had not been balanced by justice. The absence of resolution left the space feeling incomplete. People began to describe the house as holding something, not a presence in a supernatural sense, but a memory, a weight. The sense that the house remembered what had occurred, even if people tried to move on. Whether this belief was literal or metaphorical varied from person to person, but the language used to describe the house became increasingly consistent. It was described as quiet, but not peaceful, still, but not calm, ordinary, but wrong. These descriptions did not emerge all at once. They developed gradually, shaped by retellings, personal experiences, and the slow erosion of certainty. As decades passed, the murders receded into history, but the house remained immediate. Its rooms still existed. The staircase was still there. The walls still enclosed the same spaces where 8 people had been killed in their sleep. This physical continuity made the past feel close. For many, this closeness was uncomfortable. The house resisted becoming a relic. It did not feel safely distant, like a story confined to books or photographs. It stood in the present, accessible, unchanged in layout and form. Anyone could approach it. Anyone could stand where the victims had once lived. This accessibility intensified its impact. The house did not require imagination to visualize the crime. The rooms themselves provided that context. Visitors could see how close the bedrooms were to one another. They could understand how silence had been maintained. They could sense how easily movement could occur without being noticed. The architecture told part of the story. Narrow hallways, thin walls, simple construction. The house revealed how the murders were possible without relying on speculation. This clarity was disturbing. It stripped away mystery and replaced it with understanding. Understanding, in this case, did not bring comfort. It made the crime feel more real. As time passed and the Villisca Axe Murders settled into unresolved history, a new dimension began to attach itself to the story. This dimension did not originate in police files or newspaper accounts. It emerged quietly, shaped by human perception rather than evidence. It was not part of the crime itself, but part of what followed. The unexplainable did not arrive suddenly. It developed gradually as people continued to interact with a place that carried unresolved meaning. The Moore house became the focal point for this shift. Its physical presence, combined with the absence of answers, created conditions where interpretation could flourish. People did not initially speak of anything extraordinary. Early descriptions focused on mood rather than event. Visitors spoke of discomfort, heaviness, and unease. These reactions were subtle and subjective. They did not demand belief in anything beyond psychology. A space associated with violence naturally provokes reaction. But over time, language began to change. Accounts shifted from describing feelings to describing experiences. Not dramatic encounters, but moments that felt out of place. Sounds that did not seem to have a source. Sensations that were difficult to attribute to environment alone. These reports were not uniform, and they were often shared cautiously, framed as personal impressions rather than claims. This caution mattered. People were aware of how easily suggestion could influence perception. They understood that knowledge of the murders could shape experience. Many were reluctant to attribute meaning to what they felt. Yet the experiences continued, even among those who actively resisted interpretation. The house became a space where perception was heightened. Silence inside the house was often described as different from ordinary quiet. It felt heavy rather than peaceful. Sounds seemed muted, as though absorbed by the structure. Footsteps did not echo as expected. Voices felt restrained, even when spoken normally. These sensations did not point clearly toward any explanation. They existed in ambiguity. Some visitors described the feeling of being watched, not in a visual sense, but as awareness, a sense of attention without direction. This feeling did not escalate into fear. It lingered, unresolved, and difficult to dismiss. Others reported physical reactions. It also mirrored the larger Villisca story. The murders themselves are interpreted differently depending on perspective. Some focus on investigative failure, others emphasize psychological impact. Still, others consider broader patterns. No single explanation dominates. The unexplainable layer followed the same pattern. It resisted closure. As years passed, the house's reputation extended beyond Villisca. People traveled specifically to experience it. Some arrived with curiosity, others with caution, a few with skepticism. Regardless of intent, most left with a reaction. This reaction did not require articulation. It was enough that it occurred. The house did not offer proof. It offered experience. And experience, unlike explanation, does not require agreement to be valid. It exists in the moment and lingers afterward, shaping memory and perception. As Part 3C concludes, the role of the unexplainable becomes clearer. It is not presented as evidence of anything beyond human response. It does not claim answers. It exists as a layer added by time, uncertainty, and unresolved meaning. The Villisca Axe Murders created a space where explanation failed. The house filled that space with sensation, not because it was haunted, but because it was unresolved. And unresolved places do not remain silent. They continue to generate reaction. They continue to influence perception. They continue to invite interpretation. As long as the house stands, this layer remains, not as proof, but as presence. As decades passed, the Villisca Axe Murders moved beyond the boundaries of a single town and entered a wider cultural space. What had once been a local tragedy became a national reference point, not because new facts emerged, but because the absence of facts made the story adaptable. It could be retold, reshaped, and reinterpreted without contradiction. Unsolved crimes do not age the same way solved ones do. When a case is resolved, it settles into history. Its details become fixed. Its meaning stabilizes. Villisca never achieved this stability. Instead, it remained open, unfinished, and therefore usable. Each generation encountered the story differently, framing it according to contemporary concerns. Early retellings focused on shock. Newspaper accounts emphasized the brutality of the crime, the vulnerability of the victims, and the failure of the investigation. These narratives reflected a society grappling with the realization that extreme violence could occur without clear motive or resolution. As time passed, the focus shifted. Later interpretations emphasized mystery rather than violence. The murders were no longer presented primarily as an act of brutality, but as a puzzle. This shift changed how people engaged with the story. Attention moved away from the victims and toward unanswered questions. Mystery proved durable. It invited participation. Readers and listeners were encouraged to think, speculate, and imagine. The absence of a definitive answer made room for engagement rather than closure. Villisca became a story people returned to, not to learn what happened, but to confront what could not be known. This adaptability allowed the murders to survive cultural change. As society evolved, so did the story's framing. Psychological interpretations replaced moral judgments. Discussions of investigative failure replaced calls for punishment. The murders were examined as examples of systemic limitation rather than isolated evil. Each reframing kept the story relevant. The Moore House played a crucial role in this persistence. Its continued existence provided a physical anchor for cultural memory. It allowed the murders to remain tangible rather than abstract. As long as the house stood, the story had a place to return to. It prevented the crime from becoming purely symbolic. This physicality mattered. In a culture increasingly mediated by text and image, the ability to stand inside the space where history occurred created a powerful connection. Visitors did not need to imagine the setting. They could experience it directly. This immediacy reinforced the story's endurance. As interest in true crime expanded, Villisca found a new audience. Writers, documentarians, and researchers revisited the case, often presenting it as emblematic of unsolved violence. The murders were used to illustrate broader themes: the limits of forensic science, the consequences of early investigative mistakes, and the psychological impact of unresolved trauma. These interpretations did not solve the case, they contextualized it. Context allowed the story to integrate into larger narratives about crime and society. Villisca became part of a lineage of unsolved cases that challenged assumptions about justice and certainty. This lineage gave the murders symbolic weight. They were no longer just an event. They represented a category of experience, the kind that resists explanation and demands ongoing attention. The rise of modern media amplified this effect. As new platforms emerged, the story was retold again, each time shaped by the medium. Books offered depth and analysis. Documentaries emphasized atmosphere and visual impact. Oral retellings focused on emotion and suspense. Each medium highlighted different aspects, ensuring the story remained dynamic. Yet no matter the format, the core remained unchanged. 8 people were killed. No one was held accountable. The truth remained uncertain. This consistency allowed the story to retain coherence even as interpretations multiplied. The murders became a kind of cultural mirror. People projected their concerns onto it. During periods of social anxiety, the story was framed as a warning about vulnerability. During periods of introspection, it was examined as a study in uncertainty. During moments of fascination with the unexplained, it was presented as an enduring mystery. Each projection revealed as much about the present as it did about the past. This adaptability ensured that Villisca never faded. Solved cases often lose relevance once answers are accepted. Unsolved cases remain open, inviting reinterpretation. Villisca thrived in this openness. The lack of resolution protected the story from becoming outdated. As forensic science advanced, the case was revisited with renewed interest. People wondered whether modern techniques could succeed where earlier ones had failed. Yet each revisit ended the same way. Evidence had been lost. Time had erased opportunity. This reinforced the story's central theme. Some truths, once missed, cannot be recovered. This realization gave the case a kind of permanence. It was not waiting to be solved. It had become an example of what happens when resolution does not arrive. The Moore House continued to embody this permanence. Its survival into the modern era reinforced the idea that the past was not settled. The house stood as a reminder that some events remain active in memory long after they have ended in time. Visitors continued to arrive, drawn not by answers, but by experience. They did not expect clarity. They expected atmosphere. The house delivered this consistently, not through spectacle, but through presence. This consistency made it reliable as a cultural symbol. As the story circulated, it influenced how people understood unsolved crime more broadly. Villisca became a reference point in discussions about justice and uncertainty. It illustrated that the absence of resolution is not neutral. It has consequences. It shapes memory, behavior, and belief. This influence extended beyond true crime. It touched discussions about trust in systems, the fragility of safety, and the discomfort of unanswered questions. The story's endurance reflected a broader human struggle with ambiguity. Ambiguity is difficult to accept. It challenges the desire for narrative closure. It resists moral resolution. Villisca forced engagement with this discomfort, not by offering solutions, but by refusing them. This refusal became the story's defining feature. As Part 3 approaches its final segment, the cultural immortality of the Villisca Axe Murders becomes clear. The case did not survive because it was solved, nor because it was sensationalized beyond recognition. It survived because it remained incomplete. The absence of answers allowed the story to evolve without losing its core. It adapted to new contexts while retaining its unsettling simplicity. A house, a family, a night, no explanation. This simplicity ensured that the story could be retold indefinitely. As long as people continue to seek certainty, stories like Villisca will endure. They remind us that certainty is not guaranteed, that some questions remain unanswered, that some stories do not end. The Villisca Axe Murders did not fade into history. They embedded themselves into cultural memory, not as a solved crime, but as a permanent question. As the Villisca Axe Murders continued to circulate through books, documentaries, and retellings, something important became clear. The case no longer belonged to investigators, historians, or even the town itself. It had entered a shared cultural space, shaped by collective memory rather than evidence. In this space, the murders were no longer judged solely by what was known, but by what they represented. They represented the fear that order can fail. They represented the discomfort of unanswered questions. They represented the realization that violence does not always announce itself, explain itself, or resolve itself. This symbolic role allowed the story to persist without needing development. It did not require new suspects, new evidence, or new conclusions. Its power came from its refusal to conclude. In many ways, Villisca became a cautionary presence rather than a historical one. It was referenced when people discussed the limits of justice. When conversations turned toward unsolved crimes, Villisca appeared as an example of how finality is not guaranteed. It served as a reminder that certainty is not always available, even in cases of extreme violence. This reminder carried emotional weight. People are conditioned to expect resolution. Stories are expected to end. Questions are expected to be answered. Villisca disrupted this expectation. It remained open, unresolved, and resistant to narrative closure. This resistance gave the story longevity. As true crime evolved into a genre, Villisca occupied a distinct place within it. It was not sensationalized through twists or revelations. It did not offer shocking confessions or dramatic reversals. Instead, it offered atmosphere, ambiguity, and endurance. These qualities distinguished it. While other cases rose and fell in popularity, Villisca remained steady. It did not depend on novelty. It depended on absence. The lack of answers became its defining feature. The Moore house reinforced this stability. As long as the house stood, the story remained grounded in reality. It prevented the murders from becoming purely abstract. The physical space anchored the narrative, reminding people that the events were not symbolic inventions, but lived experiences that occurred in a real place. This grounding was essential. Without it, the story might have drifted into folklore entirely. With it, the story retained gravity. The house served as evidence that the unresolved was not imaginary. It was tangible. Visitors who entered the house often described a sense of continuity. The past felt close, not because it was relived, but because it had not been resolved. The house embodied this unresolved state. It stood as a structure that had not moved forward in the way people had. This contrast deepened its impact. The modern world advanced around it. Technology changed. Society evolved. Yet the house remained largely the same. This stillness created tension between past and present. The murders felt suspended rather than concluded. This suspension mirrored the psychological impact of unresolved trauma. Trauma does not fade cleanly. It lingers. It reshapes memory. It influences behavior long after the event itself has passed. The Villisca case functioned similarly on a cultural level. It lingered. It reshaped perception. It influenced how people thought about safety and certainty. As discussions around crime became more analytical, Villisca continued to resist categorization. It could not be neatly explained through motive, pattern, or psychology. Each attempt to impose structure ultimately failed. This failure became part of the story. The case illustrated the limits of explanation. It showed that not all violence can be contextualized in ways that satisfy understanding. Some acts remain opaque, regardless of effort. This opacity unsettled people. It challenged the belief that knowledge inevitably expands to fill gaps. Villisca suggested that some gaps remain permanent. This idea was uncomfortable, but it resonated. The discomfort ensured engagement. People returned to the story not because it promised answers, but because it confronted uncertainty directly. It forced acknowledgement of limits. It reminded people that some questions remain unanswered not because they are ignored, but because they are unanswerable. This acknowledgement marked a shift in how the case was perceived. Rather than being seen as a failure awaiting correction, Villisca came to be seen as a condition, an example of what happens when resolution does not occur, a reminder that closure is not always attainable. This perspective did not diminish the tragedy. If anything, it deepened it. The lack of answers amplified the loss. It prevented the story from settling into acceptance. The murders remained active in memory precisely because they resisted explanation. As Part 3 concludes, the Villisca Axe Murders stand fully transformed. They are no longer only a crime. They are a symbol of uncertainty. They are a demonstration of how unresolved violence shapes memory, behavior, and culture long after the event itself has ended. The house remains. The questions remain. The silence remains. This endurance is not accidental. It is the natural consequence of a story that never reached an ending. And in that absence, the story continues to speak. Not loudly, not dramatically, but persistently. As long as people seek certainty, stories like Villisca will endure. They remind us that certainty is not guaranteed, that justice is not inevitable, and that some events remain unresolved no matter how much time passes. The Villisca Axe Murders do not demand belief. They demand acknowledgement. Acknowledgement of limits. Acknowledgement of uncertainty. Acknowledgement that some stories do not close. They remain. As the house's reputation grew, it began to attract attention beyond Villisca. People interested in unsolved crimes sought it out. Researchers visited to better understand the setting. Writers came to absorb atmosphere. Some arrived with skepticism, others with expectation. Few left indifferent. Accounts from visitors often focused on the same elements. The silence inside. The way sound seemed muted. The feeling of being observed, even when alone. Again, these reactions were not uniform, but they were persistent. Some visitors stayed only minutes. Others left abruptly, unable to articulate why they felt compelled to go. A few reported physical reactions, such as nausea, headaches, or sudden anxiety. These experiences were subjective, and explanations varied. Yet the consistency of reaction reinforced the idea that the house exerted influence, not through force, through suggestion. The human mind is sensitive to context. When placed in a space associated with violence, it responds. The Moore house became a powerful container for suggestion. Its history primed visitors to feel something, and feeling followed. But even this explanation did not fully account for the house's effect. There were moments when reactions occurred without conscious expectation. People who entered casually without emotional investment still reported discomfort. This blurred the line between psychology and something harder to define. The house became a mirror. People projected their fears, beliefs, and interpretations onto it. Those inclined toward skepticism experienced unease they could not fully rationalize. Those inclined toward belief found confirmation in their reactions. In this way, the house absorbed whatever was brought into it. This adaptability made it enduring. As interest in the Villisca case persisted, the house became central to its legacy. It was no longer just the setting of the crime. It was part of the story itself. Discussions about the murders increasingly reference the house as an active element, not a passive backdrop. The house had outlived the investigation. It had outlasted suspects. It had remained while explanations failed. In doing so, it became the most tangible connection to the crime. For those seeking to understand what had happened, the house offered proximity. It allowed people to stand in the space where violence occurred, to confront the reality of it directly. This confrontation was rarely comfortable. The house did not provide answers. It offered experience. And experience, unlike explanation, does not resolve easily. It lingers. It invites reflection. It unsettles assumptions. As Part 3 begins, the focus shifts fully toward this transformation. The Villisca Axe Murders did not remain confined to history because the house prevented them from doing so. It anchored the crime in the present, refusing to let it fade into abstraction. The physical space held the memory in place. And as long as the house stood, the story could not fully end. The killer remained unknown. The truth remained unconfirmed. But the house remained silent, watching, waiting. As the years passed, the Moore house stopped being understood only as a location and began to be treated as a presence. This change did not happen suddenly, and it did not require belief in anything supernatural. It emerged gradually, shaped by repetition, silence, and the human tendency to assign meaning to spaces where something irreversible has occurred. The house had witnessed violence without interruption. No one intervened, no one heard, no one arrived in time. This fact alone altered how people related to the structure. It was not simply that deaths had occurred there. It was that they had occurred without resistance, without disruption, and without consequence. The house had contained the violence completely. That containment mattered. Spaces where violence spills outward often become chaotic in memory. They are remembered for noise, panic, and disorder. The Moore house was remembered for the opposite. It was remembered for quiet, for stillness, for the way nothing appeared to happen until everything was already over. This made the house feel complicit, not in a moral sense, but in a psychological one. People began to speak about it as though it had absorbed something from that night. Not an entity, not a force, but an atmosphere shaped by what it had allowed to occur. Visitors often commented on how quickly sound seemed to disappear inside. Footsteps felt softer than expected. Voices felt restrained, even when spoken normally. These observations were subtle, but they accumulated. Over time, they reinforced the perception that the house behaved differently. Again, skeptics offered explanations. Old buildings absorb sound, wood settles, layouts influence acoustics. These explanations were valid, but validity did not eliminate the reaction. Knowing why something feels unsettling does not always prevent it from feeling that way. The Moore house became a place where explanation and sensation diverged. People understood intellectually that the house was inert, yet emotionally they responded as though it were not. This contradiction was part of what made the experience difficult to dismiss. As more people entered the house over the decades, a pattern emerged. Few stayed long. Many found reasons to leave sooner than planned. Some lingered only long enough to confirm that they did not want to be there. This behavior was not dramatic. It was quiet and instinctive. Discomfort did not announce itself loudly. It whispered. The house did not provoke panic. It provoked hesitation. A pause at the doorway. A reluctance to move deeper into the rooms. A sense of urgency to step back into open air. These reactions occurred without clear cause, making them difficult to rationalize. People often reported that they felt relieved once they left. Not frightened, relieved. This relief suggested that whatever they were responding to had been tied to the space itself. The feeling did not follow them beyond the property. It remained contained, just as the violence had been. Over time, these accounts became part of the house's identity. They were shared cautiously, often framed as personal reactions rather than definitive claims. Yet the consistency of experience lent them weight. Even those who dismissed supernatural interpretations acknowledged that the house affected people. This acknowledgement marked a shift. The house was no longer discussed only in terms of its history. It was discussed in terms of its effect. This change signaled that the focus had moved from what had happened to what continued to happen. The house became active in the story. This activity was not defined by events, but by influence. The space shaped mood. It shaped perception. It shaped behavior. People adjusted how they moved, how they spoke, and how long they stayed. These adjustments were rarely conscious. They emerged naturally. The house also began to influence how the murders were remembered. As attention focused more on the setting, the victims themselves receded slightly from the center of the narrative. This was not intentional, but it was inevitable. The house was visible. It could be visited. It could be photographed. The victims existed only in memory. This imbalance reshaped the story. The murders became less about individuals and more about the place where they occurred. The house served as a physical anchor for abstract loss. It allowed people to engage with the crime tangibly, even as the human details faded. This shift carried risk. When places become symbols, they can overshadow the lives they contain. Yet in the Villisca case, the house's prominence did not erase the victims. Instead, it kept the story present. Without the house, the murders might have faded more quickly into distant history. The house prevented forgetting. As interest in the case grew nationally, the house became a focal point for those seeking connection to the story. Researchers, writers, and later visitors approached it with intention. Some wanted to understand the logistics of the crime. Others wanted to experience the atmosphere. A few arrived seeking confirmation of their beliefs. The house accommodated all of them. It did not offer answers, but it offered sensation. And sensation is powerful. It bypasses logic and speaks directly to emotion. This made the house an effective vessel for the story's endurance. The longer the house stood, the more inseparable it became from the murders. Discussions about the case increasingly began with references to the house rather than the investigation. People asked what it felt like to stand inside. They asked whether it was uncomfortable. They asked whether it seemed different from other old houses. These questions reflected a deeper shift. The story had moved from crime to experience. This transformation mirrored broader patterns in how unresolved violence is remembered. When answers are unavailable, attention turns to what remains accessible. In Villisca, what remained was the house. The house became a place where the unresolved could be felt rather than explained. This feeling did not require belief in anything beyond psychology. Trauma leaves impressions. Places associated with trauma become charged with meaning. People respond to that meaning even when they cannot articulate it. The Moore house became charged in this way. It held the weight of unanswered questions. It embodied the failure of closure. It represented the persistence of the unresolved. As Part 3A continues, the story moves deeper into this transformation. The house no longer functions merely as a backdrop. It becomes the primary lens through which the murders are understood. The violence may have ended in one night, but the space where it occurred continued to act. It continued to shape reaction. It continued to unsettle. And in doing so, it ensured that the Villisca Axe Murders would never fully recede into the past. Because as long as the house remained, the story had a place to live. As the years passed without resolution, a different kind of fear settled into Villisca and into the wider imagination surrounding the murders. It was no longer the immediate fear of violence, but a deeper, quieter anxiety. The kind that does not fade with time. The kind that exists precisely because nothing was ever confirmed. Fear usually needs an object, a face, a name, a story that explains why something happened and who was responsible. In Villisca, that object never materialized. The killer remained unknown, unpunished, and uncontained by explanation. This absence transformed fear from something reactive into something ambient. It was everywhere and nowhere. Without a known perpetrator, fear had no direction. It could not be aimed outward. It could not be resolved through punishment or understanding. Instead, it turned inward. It settled into thought patterns, habits, and assumptions. People began to imagine possibility rather than threat. Anyone could have been responsible. This idea did not emerge all at once. It developed slowly as the investigation stalled and theories collapsed. At first, people held on to hope that clarity would arrive, that a suspect would emerge, that evidence would surface. As these expectations failed, imagination filled the gap. Suspicion did not need proof to exist. It only needed uncertainty. In a small town, uncertainty carries weight. Familiarity amplifies it. When everyone knows everyone else, not knowing becomes unsettling. Every ordinary interaction carries the faint question of what remains unseen. This dynamic altered how people related to one another. Conversations became careful. Behavior was noticed more closely. Silences were interpreted. The absence of a confirmed killer meant that the crime never left the present. It was not safely contained in the past. It lingered, unresolved, influencing how people perceived one another long after the event itself. This lingering fear was not dramatic. It did not manifest as panic or hysteria. It manifested as vigilance. Doors were locked more consistently. Children were supervised more closely. Sounds at night were noticed where they once would have been ignored. These changes were subtle, but permanent. The murders reshaped daily life not through overt terror, but through sustained caution. As generations passed, this caution was inherited. Children who were not alive when the murders occurred still learned about them early. The story was passed down not as entertainment, but as warning. It became part of the town's collective memory, shaping behavior even among those with no direct connection to the event. This inheritance was psychological. It did not rely on details. Many who knew the story could not recount specifics accurately. They knew only the outline: a family, a house, a killer never found. This outline was enough to sustain fear, because the unknown is more powerful than the known. A named killer can be contextualized. Their actions can be understood within a narrative. An unknown killer resists containment. They remain abstract, adaptable, capable of becoming anything the imagination supplies. In Villisca, this adaptability allowed fear to persist long after evidence had vanished. The murders became a reference point whenever something felt wrong: a strange noise, an unfamiliar face, an unexplained event. The story surfaced in these moments, reinforcing the idea that danger could exist without warning. This reinforcement did not require belief in immediate threat. It required memory. The murders had established a precedent. They had shown that safety could be breached quietly, without disruption, and without consequence. This knowledge did not fade. It embedded itself into the community's understanding of reality. Beyond Villisca, the case affected broader perceptions of crime. As the story spread nationally, it contributed to a growing awareness that not all crimes are solved, and that not all perpetrators are identified. This awareness challenged assumptions about justice and order. It suggested that some violence exists outside the reach of explanation. This suggestion was deeply uncomfortable. It undermined the idea that systems are always sufficient, that time inevitably brings clarity. The Villisca murders stood as evidence to the contrary. They demonstrated that even extreme violence could resist resolution. As a result, the fear associated with the case became philosophical as much as emotional. It was not only fear of the killer, it was fear of uncertainty, fear that some truths remain inaccessible, fear that justice is not guaranteed. This kind of fear does not spike and fade. It settles. It becomes part of how people interpret the world. It influences expectations quietly, shaping behavior without demanding attention. The Villisca case exemplified this process. The lack of answers created a vacuum that was never filled. Over time, people stopped expecting resolution. Instead, they learned to live with ambiguity. This adaptation did not eliminate fear. It transformed it into something manageable but persistent. The murders also altered how people understood trust. In the absence of a known perpetrator, trust became conditional. It was no longer assumed. It was evaluated. This evaluation often occurred unconsciously, shaping social interactions in subtle ways. People became more observant, more cautious, less willing to dismiss unease. These changes were not extreme, but they were enduring. As the story passed from generation to generation, it lost some of its immediacy, but gained symbolic power. The murders became less about a specific crime and more about what the crime represented. They represented vulnerability. They represented the limits of knowledge. They represented the idea that not everything can be explained or resolved. This symbolism allowed the fear to persist even as details faded. The absence of a named killer meant the story could not conclude. There was no final chapter, no resolution to accept. The case remained open in spirit, if not in fact. This openness allowed fear to remain active. It invited speculation. It encouraged imagination. It resisted closure. As Part 3 continues, the focus shifts deeper into this condition. Fear without an object becomes a defining element of the Villisca legacy. It explains why the story endures, not despite the lack of answers, but because of it. The unknown does not fade. It adapts. It embeds itself into memory. And it remains, quietly influencing perception, long after the events that created it have passed. As the Villisca Axe Murders moved further into the past, fear did not disappear. It changed shape. Without a killer to identify, fear lost its sharp edges and became something more diffuse, more difficult to isolate. It was no longer tied to a person or a moment. It became a condition. This condition expressed itself most clearly in how people thought about safety. Before the murders, safety had been assumed. It was woven into daily life, reinforced by familiarity and routine. Afterward, safety became something provisional. It depended on circumstances, awareness, and luck. This shift altered how people interpreted their surroundings. Ordinary environments were no longer neutral. A quiet street could feel uneasy. A familiar house could feel vulnerable. A closed door could feel insufficient. These perceptions did not dominate thought, but they influenced it quietly. They shaped behavior without demanding attention. People adjusted without always realizing they were doing so. This adaptation extended beyond Villisca. As the story spread, it resonated with broader cultural anxieties. The idea that an entire household could be destroyed without detection challenged fundamental beliefs about order and protection. It suggested that systems meant to provide safety could fail completely. This suggestion lingered. In discussions of crime, the Villisca case became a reference point. It was cited as an example of how violence could occur without motive that made sense, without warning, and without resolution. This framing reinforced the idea that unpredictability was an inherent part of reality. The absence of a clear perpetrator intensified this effect. Without someone to blame, fear could not be externalized. It remained internal, shaping expectations rather than reactions. People became more aware of their own vulnerability, even when no immediate threat existed. This awareness was subtle but persistent. It influenced how parents spoke to children. It shaped how people approached unfamiliar situations. It informed decisions about trust. These influences were rarely dramatic. They did not provoke constant anxiety. Instead, they fostered a low-level vigilance that became normalized over time. In Villisca, this vigilance became part of communal identity. The town learned to live with the knowledge that something had happened which could not be undone or fully understood. This knowledge did not dominate daily life, but it existed beneath it, shaping perception quietly. The murders became part of the town's emotional landscape. They were not discussed constantly, but they were never forgotten. They existed as a reference point for uncertainty. When something felt wrong, the story surfaced, reminding people that intuition had value. This emphasis on intuition reflected a shift in how people understood danger. Rather than relying solely on explanation or evidence, people learned to trust unease. The murders had demonstrated that warning signs are not always obvious, and that danger does not always announce itself. This lesson carried forward. As generations passed, the details of the crime became less precise, but the emotional impact remained. Children learned about the murders through fragments, stories told by parents or teachers. These stories were rarely sensational. They were framed as caution. Something happened here. Be aware. This framing ensured that fear was transmitted without panic. It became part of the town's cultural memory, rather than an active source of distress. Yet even in this softened form, it retained power. It shaped how people interpreted silence, darkness, and routine. The lack of resolution also affected how people understood justice. The Villisca case challenged the assumption that every crime is eventually solved. It demonstrated that some truths remain inaccessible, regardless of effort. This realization altered expectations. People became less confident that systems would always deliver answers. This skepticism did not lead to distrust of authority so much as realism. It encouraged acceptance of uncertainty as a permanent feature of life rather than a temporary obstacle. This acceptance was not comforting. It required acknowledging limits to knowledge, limits to control, limits to explanation. The Villisca murders embodied these limits. They stood as a reminder that even extreme violence could resist categorization, that even thorough investigation could fail. That time, often assumed to be clarifying, could instead obscure. As a result, fear associated with the case became philosophical. It was no longer just fear of a killer. It was fear of not knowing, fear of unanswered questions, fear of the possibility that some things remain unresolved indefinitely. This kind of fear does not provoke flight or fight. It provokes contemplation. It sits with a person, encouraging reflection rather than action. It influences worldview rather than behavior. In this way, the Villisca case became more than a crime story. It became a meditation on uncertainty, on the fragility of assumptions, on the discomfort of incomplete narratives. This transformation ensured the story's longevity. Crimes that are solved eventually settle into explanation. They become fixed. Crimes that are not solved remain open, inviting reinterpretation. Villisca remained open. Each retelling emphasized different aspects, but the core remained unchanged. A family, a house, a night. No answers. This simplicity made the story adaptable. It could be framed as a historical tragedy, a psychological study, or a cultural warning. Each framing kept the story alive, ensuring that fear associated with it evolved rather than faded. The lack of closure also shaped how grief was carried. Without resolution, grief did not move toward acceptance. It lingered. It resurfaced unexpectedly. The absence of justice prevented finality, keeping the emotional impact active even as time passed. This lingering grief extended beyond those directly affected. It became communal. The town carried it quietly, integrated into identity rather than expressed openly. This integration allowed life to continue while preserving memory. As Part 3b concludes, the enduring nature of fear without resolution becomes clear. The Villisca Axe Murders did not terrify because of what was known. They endured because of what was not. The absence of answers created a space where fear could persist without diminishing. It did not need reinforcement. It sustained itself through uncertainty, alone. This persistence explains why the story continues to resonate, not because it offers clarity, but because it does not. And in that absence, fear remains, quietly shaping perception. Long after the events that created it have passed,